Just a few final comments about the chapter here before we move on to the homework. Let's go to Mounce 16.13, okay, and 16.14. Just a few comments about the semantics of verbal forms in Greek. He mentions aspect here. Remember, when we talked about aspect, we didn't really take a lot of time talking about it, but aspect has to do with how you portray the verbal action. And really, by choosing to use the present stem, what you're choosing to do is to present a verbal action in terms of either its ongoing nature, in which case you're going to translate it with an English progressive present. I am doing something. You are doing something. Or you can present it as something that is normally done. It's habitual action. It's what's done as a matter of course. The way you choose to translate it will often be dependent upon the nature of the verbal action. For example, and let me give you two verbs here. Let's take the verb to stink. Okay, so we'll take the verb to stink and the verb to jump. If I had a Greek present active indicative for jump, I might translate it as I jump, right? That would be appropriate. Or I am jumping. Do those both sound okay to you? Okay, good. Now, if I had a present active indicative of to stink in Greek, I would translate it as I stink. Would I translate it as I am stinking? Does that sound normal to you? Really? Do you look at your 13-year-old son who's come in from playing ball and said, wow, you're really stinking? Yeah, you're stinking at. But still, I think you would say to somebody, you stink at this, right? Not you are stinking at it. In fact, in my family, we don't use the progressive form of stink in this way unless it's associated with an action. Passing gas. Oh, who's stinking in here? That means who's been passing gas. So, what's the difference between the verbs jump and stink? Yes, jump is an action verb. It presents an activity that you can actually see, watch, right? Watch it unfold. Stink? That's not really an action, is it? I mean, sometimes people stink so bad it seems like an action, but it's not an action. It is what we call a stative verb. It's a verb that indicates a state, an emotional state, a physical state. Right? These are stative verbs. Verbs are verbs that indicate a state of being, a mental condition. And here's the deal. When you have a stative verb in the present active indicative in Greek, translating them into English rarely ever is appropriate with the progressive form. They just sound funny. Think about the verb to believe. That's really a cognitive and fiduciary. I'm sorry, not really fiduciary. That's a monetary term, right? But it's sort of a cognitive and spiritual state. I don't say I am believing what you say, do I? I simply say I believe what you say, right? So it has to be a rather restricted kind of situation when I would use a progressive tense to do that. To love. I look at my wife and I say, honey, I love you. Emotional state, to some degree, a state of affection. I don't say, honey, I'm loving you. Do I? That sounds funny. It should sound funny to you. Okay. Now, again, we do, in some restrictive contexts, use forms in progressive forms for stative verbs. So McDonald's, I think, is the one that made a motto of, I'm loving this, right? But that's not usually the way we talk. Okay, so be aware of this, because you're going to get to Mounce exercises, and he gives you, in his answer key, present tense translations of parsing for verbs that are really stative and not action verbs. And they're going to sound funny to me, and I'm going to tell you, I wouldn't say it that way. Okay, and this is why. And this is why I don't think it's a good idea to always sort of make the am blanking translation the default translation for present tense forms in Greek. That make sense? All right, very good. In terms of time, the action that is being portrayed by the present verb is contemporaneous with the speakers saying it, or utterance. All right. And then in 16.15, the last thing over here is that when we have these personal endings, they do make the subject pronouns that you've learned superfluous, don't they? Like if you can look at the ending of the verb, like luo, and if you look at that omega, and you don't see any other endings, you know that the subject is I, right? So do I have to say ego, luo, in order for you to know who's doing the verbal action? No. That makes the subject pronoun superfluous. And therefore, when it's used, it's going to be because the writer wants to draw attention, more attention, to the subject. What would be situations? Well, contrastive statements. You like Trump, but I like Bernie. I'm not speaking biographically or autobiographically here. I'm just trying to get you excited. So, Sue like Trump. Ego, on the other hand, like someone else. Okay, so you have contrastive statements like that. John baptized with water. I will baptize you with the Holy Spirit, or whatever. Okay, now there is one situation here where the Mounce textbook mentions the using the form of autos. So go to page 135. Okay, so 135. And look at the example he gives. We have aute. Remember what aute means? Is this the demonstrative or the independent personal pronoun? The demonstrative has the rough breathing, right? Haute. Hutas, haute, tuta. This is smooth breathing, aute. So that is the pronoun autos, right? Okay. So look at what we have. Aute leges. Look at the form of leges. Which person and number is that? It's second singular. Okay, so who's performing the action? You. You. So leges means you say. What do I make of aute here? Can I translate this as she says? If it were she says, it would be aute what? Lege, right? I'd have to use which person and number? I'd have to use the third singular. Okay, so that is she says. So aute leges cannot be she says, can it? Yeah, okay. Remember, autos can also function as an adjective, can't it? So here, it can't be the pronoun autos or aute in this case, because otherwise the verb would have to agree with the subject, and it'd have to be third person. Okay? So this is one of those adjectival uses of autos. Remember what those are? The intensive use and the identical use. And what this is it's really the intensive use. It's really you yourself say, but the form of aute here is what gender? It's feminine and singular, right? It's also nominative, and so that tells you that this is really modifying an implied su that is a feminine you. Okay? So you yourself, that is, say, and because the ending doesn't indicate any gender or number, having the form of autos does specify that the you is a feminine you. You see that? Okay. All right. Under 16.16, Mounce introduces us to what's called the master verb chart. And the master verb chart is going to basically be a synopsis of all of the indicative mood verb tenses, active, middle, and passive, where if you will learn what applies for each tense, you'll be able to basically reproduce any verb in Greek that follows the pattern. So what I've got in front of you here is the master verb chart, all filled in. So there's several rows here, and this may look very, very intimidating. The idea here is that if you learn, for example, for the present active tense, that it only uses the present stem, there's a place here for augments and reduplication. The present active indicative doesn't use one, so that'll be blank. The tense stem that it uses will be the present. This is true for all present active indicative verbs. They always use a present stem. There's no tense formative. We'll learn about those when we get to the future and the aorist tenses. It uses the connecting vowels, omicron or epsilon. And then it uses which personal endings. This is telling you which quadrant among the master personal ending chart I gave you, which quadrant is to be used. Now, which quadrant is the primary active endings? It's the top left, okay? All present active indicatives are going to use the top left quadrant to form their personal endings. And then it always gives you the first person singular paradigm form. So the present active indicative's first person singular form will be here, okay? So what I'm going to ask you to do is with each chapter, we're going to be adding new rows. And the information in the rows will apply to the verbs that are in those tenses. So you're going to reproduce this first row for your chapter 16 quiz. You're going to reproduce the master personal endings chart in the top left corner quadrant for your quiz, as well as doing some parsings and then answering questions about the present tense and in vocab words. Okay, so memorize this. Nothing goes in augment and tense form, but it uses the present stem, these connecting vowels, this set of endings, and use luo for the paradigm form. Okay. All right. And you'll get a handout here of this in just a minute.